Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. He's a journalist and former editor who wears many hats and writes on about as many, whether it is about the political developments in India or about food or travel or celebrities or business. Vir Sanghvi is a name that is quite popular and well known both amongst the journalistic community and amongst readers and viewers. He's had an up and down journey himself, filled with the many trials and tribulations, including, of course, the infamous media Radiya Tapes controversy. And he's now put all of that into a memoir called A Rude Life. It basically travels through his own journey with India over the last many decades and in true form doesn't pull any punches and is filled with many, many anecdotes. Joining me now to talk about that and to talk about the here and now of journalism as well is the man himself, Vir Sanghvi. Thank you, Vir, for joining in and speaking with me, and congratulations on another book, one more to notch on your belt. I was not amused, perhaps I can't find the right word, bemused maybe, to read how you talked about how it was a memoir and you decided at 65 it was time to write it. You're not at the end of the road by any long shot, are you? I'm sure there's lots more coming.
I'm not even sure of that. I sometimes feel all decrepit and washed up. But honestly, it wasn't that I turned 65 or I've just turned, but I turned 64 when I started writing it. It was more that there was the lockdown. I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even research things by meeting people or whatever. So the only thing I could write about was myself, which of course is an egotistical thing to do, but it was a way of killing time. So I just sat at home and wrote it. I wrote one chapter a day, which is about 2,500 words. There are 61 chapters and I didn't write every day. So it was over in about 90 days. So it was 90 days of lockdown killed with something useful.
No, and that is extremely diligent behavior for a writer as well. I think anyone who's a journalist or attempted to write a piece will see that in the way you put your timeline. Do you feel tired though in terms of the journalistic journey, Veer? I know that you started really, really young, did you not?
Yeah, I started before I went to university. So I started when I was 19. But no, I don't feel particularly tired. The journalism is okay. I'm very happy doing journalism. What tires me out is running organizations, running newspapers, television channels, meeting people to set up things, to manage teams, coping with people's problems, motivating people. All of that, I think, I'm a bit tired now.
Hmm. There was another interesting observation that I saw that you made in a conversation with someone saying, and this was harking back to the Rajiv Gandhi period. And I'm going to go, back and forth with a lot of things that you've covered in your book. Where you said it was a great time for journalists. Then you talked about the years of instability that followed, and that again, it was very interesting, journalistically to cover that. And the fact that at this point you feel it is a low because the current regime has no interest in engaging with the media. But is that exactly true? It's just that the terms of engagement are very different at this point, are they not? There is certainly a huge degree of engagement, but it's run more like perhaps a PR machine rather than a journalistic enterprise.
I think so. I think that you're absolutely right. They are willing to engage with media if we all become parts of DAVP or some government PR machine. But that to me is not engaging with media. And engagement with media involves being accountable, answering questions, being able to be put on the spot and still getting around it, persuading people, convincing people. They don't really do any of that. I mean, there is a certain section of media that thinks they're wonderful, and that section of media reports what wonderful things they say in their wonderful television channels and their wonderful publications. But I don't call that engagement with media.
Do you think we'll ever step back from where we are, though, Veer? I mean, this happened at the time when there were elections in America as well, and Trump was removed. There was a new party and a new, hope and a new sort of narrative. But for a lot of people, they felt that so much damage had been done, it would be very difficult to step back from it. For the journalistic world, do you feel it's sort of the same, that if and when things do change, there's too much water that's flown under the bridge?
I think so. I think we're different in one important respect, which is that throughout that chaotic Trump presidency, the media would not be silenced. The media kept attacking him, kept uncovering what he was doing and writing about it. That hasn't happened here. Over here, the media have been co-opted, have become effectively part of the government PR machine. So the damage to the media in India, I think, is much more substantial. The media remained thriving and performed an important democratic function in America by making information available. And in some way, I think, contributed to people making up their own mind about Trump, which, as we've seen in the last election, was a negative impression. That doesn't happen here. The media sort of partners in this exercise of governance by the government.
I want to go back to the starting point for your book, where I think you've also mentioned that for the first time it's very personal. You're not writing about an event or an outcome or a setup. It's this entire journey of India through your eyes. The most pivotal moment, perhaps, for you was the entire Radiya Tapes controversy. Veer. You've talked about
Right.
that. You've talked about the tapes and the fact that there was proof put forward about the fact that they were doctored. Do you think that the issue got addressed in the way that you would have liked it to, in terms of the clarifications, or do you still think that there was a
No,
lot of
I,
ambiguity?
I think there was a problem. I think the Radiya Tapes issue had a certain power that, say, Pegasus doesn't, though Pegasus is, of course, the much more important issue. The Radiya Tapes were manipulated. The whole taping was done, the whole tapping was done by the finance ministry on flimsy grounds, on the grounds that somebody wrote an anonymous letter about Neera Radia, which apparently is all you need to tap people's phones. After those taps were done, for no apparent reason, they found nothing. People in the finance ministry sold those tapes to various businessmen, or at least one businessman. Those tapes were then leaked to the media in an organized manner. There were audio recordings sent to various newspapers, they were leaked to magazines, transcripts were leaked. The tapes, what, I don't know how many thousands of conversations there are, they leaked about 50 in the hope of getting a certain amount of attention. Initially, with the exception of Outlook, I think there were no other significant publication, the media held firm and said, we're not sure about the authenticity of these tapes. But once Outlook ran it, and once I think the BJP's troll army and the IT cell got involved, and it became a huge, huge social media thing, the rest of the media felt obliged to cover it. Nobody asked the basic question, why was this phone being tapped? B, how do we know that these tapes are genuine? I remember demonstrating with Vinod Mehta, who was then the editor of Outlook, and saying that these tapes are not genuine. And he said, humne likh diya. We cannot vouch for the authenticity. So that was like the level of authentication or anything anybody wanted. And those tapes had a certain power because you were hearing people talk. The problem with the Pegasus thing, which is enormous in its scope, it suggests that the government has come in and hacked our computers, knows all our information, that if you were to oppose the government in some way, they had the ability to destroy your life. And though Pegasus hasn't yet shown us evidence, we certainly found evidence of people planting information on people's computers and then arresting them on sedition charges or calling them anti-nationals. So the scope of Pegasus is enormous. In the case of the Radiya tapes, it was a circus, it was a spectacle. They created a scandal, the media bought it. They didn't, if you will notice, there are very few, if any, politicians on the Radiya tapes because they kept all of those out. I know, for instance, that one prominent politician today was a client of Neera Radia's. None of his tapes were ever released. It was done in a calculated manner to create a diversion when the 2G scam broke. And the media, always eager for a story that fell into their laps, lapped it up. Afterwards, the CBI, I think, told the Supreme Court on 3 separate occasions that the tapes had been doctored. The Supreme Court accepted that. I had those tests done, which Outlook carried. Nobody was really interested. The world had moved on. What was it that Churchill says? A lie goes around the world 3 times before the truth even has the time to get its pants on. I think that's probably what happened.
Let me take on 2 points of contention from your peers, though, within that conversation, Veer. One comes
Sure.
from Hartosh Singh Bal, who, the political editor at Open, who writes that for us it was not about the tapes, it was the fact that Veer was writing exactly what had been dictated to him. And in his words, he says, Radia's dictation turned out to be Sanghvi's original sin, not the 2G scam. And secondly, the person whose name you raised, Vinod Mehta, who said in 2014 that they stood by the report, that they didn't get the clarification they sought from you, and it didn't get resolved. How would you respond to
I'll,
both?
I'll, I'll answer,
Yeah,
I'll
please.
answer both. I think this gentleman, the first man who I don't really know, what was the name?
Hartosh
The
Singh.
first person you quoted?
Hartosh Singh.
Okay, so this Mr. Hartosh Singh refers to a tape that was tested, and when we tested it, the voice on the tape was not even recognizable as mine. I said this to Outlook to various people. That's clearly the audio has been so badly manipulated that it does not sound like me. Now, you can't really come to conclusions on the basis of a doctored tape. So I think that answers that question. In the case of Vinod, yes, he did say he stood by that. Completely stood by that. And I then went to court. And as a consequence of that court action, I think Outlook had to publish a note of regret and say it withdrew all the allegations.
Is there anything you would want to change about that period, Veer, and how things went or how you responded to it? Because I think it was also a different place and time. Now there's so many sort of platforms to put your point of view across, whether it's Twitter or otherwise. Would you have done it differently?
I think so. I think what happened when the tapes first came out, and the tapes came out not from an unfriendly source, from Vinod. I used to write for Outlook. He was one of my oldest friends in journalism, and he carried them, he says, because they were an important story. He thought he didn't want to get the tapes authenticated, and presumably, if they'd had the tapes authenticated, I had run the tests that were run by the CBI and me later, they would have found out they weren't authentic, and the story would have been lost. So he just ran with the story. I don't know what else I could have done about the journalism. I did go on Headlines Today or India Today and speak about it. I did put a clarification on my site the moment it happened. But what took me by surprise was not the journalistic response, but Twitter was relatively new. And I'd been on Twitter for a couple of years. And there was this onslaught on Twitter of people saying, terrible, he should be arrested, he should be sacked, he should be hanged, etc. And I don't think any of us realized then what a glove puppet was, what a troll farm was, what the IT cell was. We sort of took everybody on Twitter, which was quite a gentle place then, at face value. I would now recognize it immediately for what it was, a concerted campaign, and would fight it accordingly. At that stage, I thought it was genuine and it worried me.
I think it's a new age oxymoron, be gentle Twitter.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned in your books that there's some pieces or names that you haven't written for fear of libel. While libel may have been on your mind, was this kind of hate on your mind as well while writing?
No, I mean, I'm trying to think. I think there are about 2 or 3 cases where I haven't named the people. I've talked about an industrialist who tried to destroy Dhirubhai Ambani. Also, Dhirubhai Ambani told me, but I only had Dhirubhai's word. He's not alive to corroborate that he said it. I had no proof. I didn't put it in. Haji Mastan told me, who was organizing the gold smuggling from Dubai. It's a prominent Dubai family. They're still around. I can't really libel them on the word of a former smuggler, so I didn't include that. And the Radiya Tapes, the person who organized that, was obviously somebody who had the clout in Mr. Chidambaram's finance ministry to go in, organize tapes, to organize tapping, to be able to get access to the tapes, to be able to sit on them for so long, had a well-organized media structure in Delhi with somebody who knew editors well, knew the media well, who was able to send transcripts to various people, knew who to contact. So, I mean, by a process of elimination, there aren't that many people you could blame for it. But again, this is just deduction. I have no proof. So this is, I think, only 3 cases where I haven't named people.
Do you want to do that now? This is digital. Go for it.
No. If I have proof, and I only have the word of people from the media saying that they came to us with the tapes, etc. But those are private communications to me, so I can't come to any conclusions. But I mean, what can you say? Ultimately, karma catches up with everyone, right?
Or so we hope. What's also fascinating.
I think in this case it's happened, so it's okay.
What's fascinating in your case, as I was saying, is that there's so many parallel tracks that you covered as a journalist. You weren't just a political journalist. You also wrote about food, of course, that you still do, and celebrities. As a business journalist, I often feel painted into the grayest corner of the room. What was for you the most exciting or engaging conversation that you had from someone from the world of business that really, lingered for you?
Well, lots of people in business I thought were interesting. Many of them, most of them were bores. I mean, let's put this up front and on the table. But there were many, many interesting people. I thought that Kumar Birla was less interesting than his father. I interviewed his father in what must have been for Bombay Magazine in 1980. And he talked at length. In those days, you couldn't write very much of this because nobody was interested. He talked at length because he was traveling all through East Asia and setting up subsidiaries for his corporation. And he said, I would wake up sometimes in a hotel room in the morning, not know where I was. And I was wondering, why the hell am I doing this? What good is it? We are big enough in India. So there were moments of self-doubt and questioning, which are not really part of the public image of Aditya Birla. And yet I thought that was interesting. I met Dhirubhai, as I say in the book, for the first time around 78, 79. And just to watch his trajectory, just to watch him grow, I thought was fascinating. In almost every conversation with Dhirubhai, I learned something in the way in which he saw the world, what he was doing. I found Ratan Tata a very invigorating man to talk to because though he's a very reticent and silent man, when he does talk, there's never any lies. He talks honestly. And I did this interview, it's in the book Men of Steel, where he talked about how one of his problems was that he was lonely. And he said, I am too reticent to do anything about it. So I continue to be lonely. So I liked conversations with people like Ratan who gave me an insight into what it is like. Dhirubhai gave, personal insights into his personality. He talked about business, he talked about politics, but the way in which he talked about them, I think there was a lot to learn. Nandan Nilekani has always been a friend, even before he became Nandan Nilekani, and I have learned from every conversation with him. The first interview I did with Murthy, long before Narayan Murthy became famous or anyone had heard of Infosys, when the stories he told about how he gave up being a communist, etc., which now are, I think, often told and well known, I think were fascinating. So there were many, many businessmen I enjoyed talking to.
Glad to hear that.
Richard Branson. I've interviewed Richard Branson thrice, and each time it's been entertaining.
That I don't find surprising. A lot of your journey is also plotted through the prime ministerial ascendancy through the years with the various prime ministers you interacted with. What's interesting in this day and age is how often people draw parallels between Indira Gandhi and Prime Minister Modi.
Yeah.
How do you see that? Do you think it's the grand tradition of whataboutery at play, or do you think there are serious parallels to be drawn and seen between how the two conduct themselves?
I think there are huge parallels, both in terms of the fanatical support they command among their supporters, also the support they command at large in the country. Like Rajiv Gandhi got many more votes than Narendra Modi did, but Rajiv Gandhi was loved. I don't think he was admired and people were frightened of him, or this aura of power around Rajiv Gandhi that there was around his mother and that there was around, and there is around Mr. Modi. So I think the parallel there is accurate. Mr. Modi's exercise of power is also absolute in a way that it hasn't been since Indira Gandhi. During the Indira Gandhi period, many of her supporters believed that there was no distinction to be made between Indira Gandhi's interests and India's interests. You had that famous D.K. Barua statement of, Indira is India and India is Indira. Well, I think many of Mr. Modi's supporters believe that to attack Mr. Modi is to attack India. Hence the use of the word anti-national for anyone who's anti-government. So yes, there are parallels.
You've related or recounted an incident and a conversation with Rajiv Gandhi as well, where he talks about state elections and the fact that he was able to draw very large crowds, people came to see him, but that doesn't necessarily translate into victories on ground in states. Do you think some of that is really sort of taking strong form and shape in what we're seeing in state elections now? And do you think it has repercussions for what happens at the central level?
Yeah, I think we sometimes get misled by the size of rallies because, as Ramesh Thapar once famously said, India's great contribution to the international political tradition is rent a crowd. I mean, so many of our rallies, particularly rallies by important politicians are rent-a-crowd rallies. So you shouldn't judge the crowd so much. Also in villages where there isn't that much to do, where life can be quite boring, the sense of an helicopter landing, of many people coming, it's like a tamasha. There's something happened that they go. Also, on the obvious point, which is that Mr. Modi may be popular at a central level, he's not necessarily that popular when it comes to state governance. He did, for instance, much worse in Bengal than he did in the in the assembly elections than he did in the Lok Sabha election. That's the most recent example, and that happened with Rajiv after he won these great mandates at the national level. He wasn't able to repeat it necessarily at the state level. I think people are smart enough to make that distinction.
But do you think, as a polity, this idea that is currently being talked about of how states move differently, but the central leadership will be different, a more federal structure in that sense, will take form and shape? Do you think we're headed that way, or you disagree?
Well, I've had the same conversation in 1985 when Rajiv Gandhi won the biggest mandate possible and then lost the Karnataka state elections, which Hegde won, even though Karnataka had voted overwhelmingly for the Congress in the parliamentary elections a few months before. So we've always talked about it, that people will now create a federal structure, the states will become much more important. And we had some sense of it, I thought, during the Gujral and Devegowda prime ministerships. But I don't know if there is a consistent move in that direction, because Mr. Modi's first term upended all of that.
Yeah. A lot of what we're living through also has, has a throwback element to it. When we talk about Rafael, people talk about Bofors. COVID, of course, has been a once in a lifetime experience for all of us. Pegasus seems to go back to many other such tapping episodes. Each time people feel this is it. This is the one thing that's really going to tip the scale. This is going to be a really game-changing event for the government in power. Is it your sense that any of these might actually shape up to be that? And if not, why?
I'm always reluctant to make predictions. Let's take them one by one. Which do you think is the major event that could change things now?
You tell me.
I don't think anything will change things. I think the fact that Mr. Modi screwed up demonetization so badly, and many of the people who were worst affected by demonetization continued to vote for him. The fact that, according to psephologists like Sanjay Kumar, in the Bihar elections, many of the migrants who'd been left penniless on the road after the pandemic struck and after the lockdown was imposed, continued to vote for Mr. Modi. So I'm not really sure if there's going to be a single event that will change things for Mr. Modi. I think Mr. Modi is, and I've said this in the book, I think Mr. Modi is different from many other politicians in that people vote for him not because of performance, not for what he does, but because of who he is. He's become the personification of a certain kind of strong Hindu identity and a Hindu pride. For other people, he's become a symbol of a new emerging middle class, which hates the old middle class, the so-called Lachan's lobby. And for people in the villages and people at the bottom of society, there are very real welfare measures which we sometimes ignore when we talk about his performance. I've spoken to people who are incredibly grateful for what he's done. So if you say to these people that, he's been snooping on you, they'll say, yeah, so what? Who cares? They'll still vote for him.
You think generally Indians are not that affected by invasion of privacy? So in that sense, you think Pegasus may not have the full impact that it might in other nations?
I think so. I think that's true. And also, while Pegasus is much more sinister and much worse than anything that's ever happened before, there is no tradition of governments respecting our privacy. They've been reading our mail. They've been tapping our phones for a very, very long time. The only difference with, say, the Radiya Tapes was that we now advanced to the commercial level where they were doing these at the behest of industrialists and selling them to industrialists, which fortunately hadn't happened before. And with Pegasus is that it's much more sinister because they're not just listening to phone calls, and to treat it as phone tapping is in some ways a mistake. They're getting into your computers, they're getting into all your private information. They have the ability to tamper with your information. There's not a single bank transaction you will make that they won't be aware of. They have the ability to turn on your phone remotely so the camera works. that they can watch what you're doing. That is much, much more sinister when we compare it to a phone tapping scandal in some way that takes away from the gravity of the scandal.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think the mistake people are doing is, trying to draw parallels between the two, because they are, in all honesty, completely different. Uh, Even with the stock market, sometimes when you're going through a bad patch, it's always a good idea to speak to people who've seen a lot of stock market cycles, because what looks like you've never seen it before has actually happened before. And it's the same for you. You've seen so many of these cycles. Do you share the despondency that many who are watching the situation in India do now? Do you think it's warranted to be worried about our future, or do you believe it's one of those cycles amongst the many cycles that you have chronicled over the years, and you think we're going to turn in whatever direction? Frankly, I mean, none of us can call it, but do you think it's just a part of a cycle?
That's again so difficult to answer. I remember during the emergency, when the opposition was locked up, the press was censored, the Supreme Court had turned into Mrs. Gandhi's poodle. You had a sense that this was irreversible, that nothing would ever change, and the lights had gone out on Indian democracy. And yet it wasn't irreversible, it was reversible. During the Rajiv Gandhi phase, you had a sense that the Congress would now be in power forever, and yet it wasn't. So my view on all of these things is things like Mr. Modi's popularity and his way of doing things will remain popular until one day it won't. That day will come.
We wait and watch. I wanted to end on a light note with you, Veer. I
Yeah.
have no timer and no bell, but I've got a couple of rapid fire questions for you.
Oh dear. Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
you can't take more than 2 seconds to answer them, even though there's no consequences for it. But I'm hoping that you will honor the
I
nature of the game.
thought it was going to be this Karan Johar element. I would have done makeup and dressed up. But go ahead.
You look just fine, and your background makes up for all of it. So whenever you're ready to go, yeah.
I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay. Favorite Indian politician.
Chandrasekhar.
Favorite global politician.
Probably Tony Blair, of the ones I've met, of the people I've read about and all that, many others. But the one who impressed me the most when I met him, Tony Blair.
Okay. Most frustrating interviewee.
Too many to mention, but I would imagine Narasimha Rao because he never answered a question.
Most charming interviewee.
Rajiv Gandhi, because he engaged with you even though you were a lowly young reporter and he was Prime Minister of India. He engaged with you on equal terms.
One
And
politician.
Shah Rukh Khan, and Shah Rukh Khan, and Shah Rukh Khan. And Shah Rukh Khan, who is a little bit like Tony Blair. I don't think he's met anyone in his life he couldn't charm or persuade.
One politician you haven't got a chance to interview and would like to.
Narendra Modi.
One
That's
thing.
self-evident. I think every journalist would probably give the same answer.
One thing you'd like to change about news today.
I would like there to be more news. Where is the news?
One thing we would never find in your kitchen.
Oh God, I'm trying to think. Organ meats and stuff like that. I'm not keen on kidneys, livers, brains, those kind of foods. I'm at heart a Gujarati.
Okay. And one thing we would always find in your kitchen.
Lots of spices, lots of salt, lots of things like mustard, stuff that has strong flavors.
What's a pithy one-liner that you would want to send out for young journalists today, Veer?
Think again. This profession is dying and it's not in good shape.
Oh dear. And the final one, a show or a film that you've recently watched and you highly recommend.
Oh, The West Wing. My wife and I watched it again from scratch, and we're currently watching Homeland again from scratch from episode 1. It's frightening how little we remember of the first season. So obviously I'm getting old.
And how similar everything that we're living through looks like in these series, is it not?
Absolutely. It's frightening and terrifying in many ways. Though The West Wing is such an elevated view of politics that nothing we're living through is anything as good as that.
That's very true. Such a pleasure speaking with you, Veer. Congratulations on your book. I don't think you're anywhere near the finish line, so I'm sure there's lots more coming. I wish you all the very best in everything that's coming up and for this book, of course. Thank you very much for chatting with me.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Bye.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.